That's exactly the dilemma confronting the United States today as Russian warships and nuclear submarines suddenly appear in the Caribbean waters, practically on America's doorstep. The mainstream media tells us it's a show of force. Washington frames it as aggression. But I want us to take a step back and ask, what does this really mean? When Russian warships sail into the Caribbean, the world pays attention. For many Americans, the image of a Russian frigate or submarine cruising just off the coast of Cuba or Venezuela evokes an uneasy sense of déjà vu. It brings back memories of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and those tense moments when the superpowers pushed each other to the brink. But here we are again, watching Moscow extend its naval power into a region long considered the United States' own backyard. The immediate question is, what message is Russia sending, and why now? Let's start with the most obvious hook: proximity. When Russian naval vessels appear only a few hundred miles from the U.S. mainland, they cut through layers of diplomatic abstraction and force themselves into the American imagination. It is one thing to hear about Russian maneuvers in the Arctic or the Black Sea, but when the same military presence emerges just outside Miami's latitude, the issue becomes visceral. This proximity is not accidental, it is calculated. Russia knows that operating in the Caribbean sends a psychological message, one that resonates far beyond the actual military capacity of the ships involved. Another crucial layer is symbolism. The Caribbean has always been more than a cluster of islands. It has been a geopolitical chessboard. For centuries, control of these waters meant influence over trade routes, colonial power, and strategic dominance. When Russia positions warships here, it is deliberately inserting itself into a region historically dominated by Washington. This is less about military necessity and more about saying, we, too, can project power into your sphere of influence. It is a performance, a gesture meant to challenge the myth of U.S. invulnerability. The timing matters as well. Russia's naval display comes at a moment of heightened tension with the West over Ukraine, NATO expansion, and global sanctions. By sailing into the Caribbean, Moscow is responding to American and European pressure with a reminder of its own capabilities. It is essentially declaring, you surround us with bases and alliances, we can appear on your doorstep. 2. This tit-for-tat dynamic is not new, but it is increasingly sharp in today's multipolar order. And it raises an uncomfortable question for U.S. as policymakers. Can America still claim exclusive dominance of its hemisphere? Of course, the practical military threat of a handful of Russian vessels is limited. These ships cannot overturn U.S. naval supremacy in the Atlantic, but to dismiss their presence as mere theatrics would miss the point. Power in international politics is not just measured in firepower. It is also measured in perception. The sight of Russian naval ensigns in Caribbean ports or submarines lurking in warm tropical waters is a visual metaphor for a shifting balance of power. It is Russia's way of telling the United States that its reach is global, not confined to its own shores. And let us not forget the role of allies. Russia's Caribbean presence is often tied to relationships with countries like Cuba and Venezuela, governments that themselves challenge U.S. influence in the region. By docking in Havana or Caracas, Russia is reinforcing those ties and signaling that U.S. sanctions and isolation efforts are not universally effective. Every visit strengthens Moscow's diplomatic hand while reminding Washington that the Western Hemisphere is not closed off to outside influence. For the American public, this development stirs anxieties that echo across generations. The hook is clear. If Russian warships can sit this close, what else might they do? Media coverage amplifies this fear, framing the situation as a direct challenge to national security. Yet at the same time, it forces Americans to confront a contradiction the United States has long deployed its own forces around the world, often right on Russia's borders. When Moscow does the same, the narrative flips, exposing the double standard at the heart of global military politics. Ultimately, Russian warships in the Caribbean are less about military dominance and more about psychological and geopolitical leverage. They are floating reminders that America's once unchallenged sphere of influence is now contested, that global power is shifting, and that the assumptions of the past no longer guarantee security in the present. When those gray hulks slice through Caribbean waters, they carry not just sailors and missiles, but also a message. The era of unilateral U.S. control is over, and the world is watching. History has a way of circling back, and nothing demonstrates that better than the echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis in today's standoff between Russia and the United States. The image of Russian warships appearing in the Caribbean immediately pulls us back into 1962, a year when the world quite literally held its breath. For 13 days in October of that year, the planet teetered on the brink of nuclear war. American families were building fallout shelters in their backyards. Schoolchildren were crouching under desks during duck and cover drills, and every television broadcast carried the heavy tone of looming catastrophe. Now, more than 60 years later, the sight of Russian vessels once again entering these waters awakens those old fears, even if the circumstances are different. The hook is clear whenever a foreign power challenges American dominance so close to home, the ghosts of 1962 rise. The Cuban Missile Crisis was never just about missiles. It was about spheres of influence, about the right of one superpower to place weapons near the other's borders, and about how far each side would go to test the resolve of the other. The U.S. had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, pointing them directly at the Soviet Union. In response, the Soviets attempted to place their own missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. The logic was simple: if you can threaten us at close range, we can do the same to you. This mirrored symmetry of threat and counter. Threat became the essence of the Cold War, and its traces are visible today in Russia's decision to sail warships into the Caribbean. What makes the parallel so striking is not just the geographical similarity, but the psychological impact. In 1962, Americans suddenly realized that the safety of their homeland was not guaranteed. For decades, wars had been fought overseas, with oceans serving as protective barriers. The Cuban Missile Crisis shattered that illusion. Today, the presence of Russian warships so close to U.S. shores touches the same nerve. It forces Americans to once again confront vulnerability, to imagine what it means when an adversary has the capability to operate within striking distance. That visceral unease is precisely why Russia chooses the Caribbean as its stage. The echoes go even deeper. In 1962, the confrontation ended not with a military clash, but with negotiation. A secret deal in which the U.S. removed its missiles from Turkey while the Soviets pulled theirs out of Cuba. That resolution revealed something important. Behind the posturing and the brinkmanship, both powers recognized the need for compromise. Today, when Russia projects force into the Caribbean, it is not only reviving memories of crisis, but also pointing toward the same demand for reciprocal recognition. If the United States insists on pushing NATO to Russia's borders, Moscow will respond in kind by approaching America's sphere of influence. The logic is relentless, the symmetry unavoidable. This historical echo also reminds us of how public narratives are shaped. In 1962, President Kennedy was celebrated for his toughness in forcing the Soviets to back down, while the quiet U.S. concession of removing missiles from Turkey was largely hidden from public view. That selective storytelling framed America as the victor, shielding its population from the reality of compromise. Fast forward to today, and we see similar patterns. The media emphasizes Russian aggression while downplaying America's own military expansions. The hook here is that the past does not simply repeat itself. It teaches us how the same power dynamics are rebranded for each generation. There is another layer worth drawing out. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked the closest the world has come to nuclear war, and its shadow has haunted international relations ever since. Every maneuver involving great powers near each other's borders carries a residue of that fear. When Russian warships sail into the Caribbean today, they may not be carrying nuclear missiles, but they are carrying the memory of nuclear brinkmanship. That memory alone is powerful enough to rattle markets, shape foreign policy, and stir public anxiety. It is a reminder that history is never buried. It is always waiting to be awakened by the right trigger. Ultimately, the echoes of 1962 show us that these moments are not isolated incidents, but recurring dramas in a long geopolitical theater. Each act may look different, but the script is familiar: great powers pushing boundaries, signaling strength, and risking escalation in the process. The presence of Russian warships in the Caribbean is not just a modern provocation. It is a deliberate revival of one of the most dramatic episodes of the Cold War, designed to remind Washington that it, too, can be made to feel the unease it so often inflicts on others. And for the American public, the hook remains as sharp as ever when history repeats in the Caribbean. The question is whether we have learned enough from the past to avoid reliving its most dangerous consequences. Russia's decision to send warships into the Caribbean is more than a symbolic gesture. It is a direct message to Washington, a geopolitical reminder that if the United States insists on pushing up against Russia's borders, Moscow has the means and the will to return the favor. This is not simply about naval exercises or routine deployments. It is about demonstrating parity in a global chess game where proximity equals pressure. The hook is sharp. The very logic that Washington has used to justify its actions abroad is now being mirrored back at it, and the reflection is deeply unsettling. For decades, the U.S. has maintained a forward posture around the globe, stationing troops and weapons near rivals as a way to project dominance and deter challenges. NATO's eastward expansion, which has steadily inched closer to Russia's borders, is perhaps the clearest example. From Moscow's perspective, the presence of American missiles and bases in Poland, Romania, and other Eastern European states is not defensive, but provocative. When Russian officials argue that they are being encircled, they are pointing to a reality that Americans often prefer to ignore. What Russia is now doing in the Caribbean is a carefully constructed response, a demonstration of the principle that if you can live near our borders, we can live near yours. This tit for tat logic has a long history in international politics, but it is especially potent here because it strikes at the heart of America's self-image. For generations, the United States has viewed the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence, a concept rooted in the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. That doctrine asserted that no foreign power would be permitted to meddle in the Americas without facing U.S. retaliation. Yet the irony is that Washington has never applied the same restraint to itself, consistently involving itself in the affairs of Europe, Asia, and beyond. Now, by parking warships in the Caribbean, Russia is holding up a mirror, forcing the U.S. to see how it feels when the same principle is applied against it. The symbolism is amplified by geography. Russian ships in the Caribbean are not just in international waters. They are close enough to remind Americans of their own vulnerability. That nearness translates into political pressure. Suddenly, theoretical debates about NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe feel much less abstract. The message is simple. If Washington insists on projecting power into Russia's neighborhood, Moscow can and will reciprocate. And that reciprocity, even if limited in scale, has the power to change the tone of global diplomacy. What makes this maneuver especially effective is that it challenges the double standards embedded in the U.S. narrative. American officials often present NATO's presence near Russia as a purely defensive measure, but they frame Russia's presence in the Caribbean as naked aggression. For the global audience, this discrepancy is glaring. It highlights the fact that the U.S. expects to act with impunity while condemning others for the same behavior. Russia's move, therefore, is not only a challenge to Washington, but also a strategic play for international legitimacy. By exposing this imbalance, Moscow strengthens its claim that the world is moving toward a multipolar system where no single power can dominate unchallenged. The timing adds another layer. The United States is already embroiled in multiple crises: domestic economic inequality, political polarization, and costly foreign commitments. Inserting warships into the Caribbean at such a moment allows Russia to magnify those pressures. It forces U.S. leaders to respond, to allocate resources and attention to yet another front. This stretching of American bandwidth is part of the strategy. Remind Washington that it cannot control every theater simultaneously, and that its attempts to do so come with costs. For the American public, the hook is visceral. Seeing Russian ships in the Caribbean sparks immediate concern. If they are here, what could they do next? This anxiety feeds the broader narrative that U.S. security is no longer guaranteed by oceans and distance. That unease is precisely the effect Russia wants to generate, not because it plans to launch attacks from the Caribbean, but because it wants to shift the psychological balance of power. In geopolitics, perception often matters as much as reality, and the perception of vulnerability can alter decision making at the highest levels. By sailing into the Caribbean, Russia is sending a calculated message that global power is no longer a one-way street, and Washington will have to live with the same pressures it has long imposed on others. The hook is sharp, unavoidable, and deeply political. If the United States insists on surrounding Russia, then Russia will remind America what it feels like to be surrounded in turn. The emergence of Russian warships in the Caribbean is not just a military maneuver or a symbolic poke at Washington. It is a signal of a deeper transformation in the global order. For much of the 20th century, the world was defined by bipolarity, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in rivalry. With the Soviet collapse in 1991, that bipolar system gave way to a unipolar moment where the United States stood unrivaled as the world's dominant power. But today, that unipolarity is eroding, and the appearance of Russian naval power in America's backyard is a vivid reminder that the age of multipolarity has arrived. The hook is immediate. The U.S. is no longer the sole director of global affairs, and the stage is now crowded with new actors determined to claim their share of influence. Multipolarity means more than just competition. It means multiple centers of power shaping world events simultaneously. Russia's naval presence in the Caribbean is a statement that it is still a major actor on that stage, refusing to be marginalized by Western sanctions or diplomatic isolation. By deploying ships so close to the United States, Russia is reminding the world that it cannot be written off as a regional player. Instead, it is asserting itself as part of a larger constellation of powers, including China, India, and others, that together challenge Washington's